I died of dysentery approximately 847 times in an elementary school computer lab. And I kept playing. There's something about Oregon Trail that made failure feel like learning and not punishment. Me and my classmates would literally line up to struggle with that game. And I would download it again right now in a heartbeat. Think about that for a second. We had students begging for the chance to fail repeatedly at something genuinely difficult. There weren't any participation trophies. There was no gentle redirection when Mary broke her leg or we ran out of ammunition. Just honest feedback and the irresistible urge to try again. What did that pixelated pioneer simulator understand about learning that we've somehow forgotten in our rush to make everything accessible and engaging? And more importantly, how do we bring that productive struggle energy back to the English classroom? I'm Danielle, and today we're talking about why the best learning happens when failure is expected, feedback is immediate, and students choose to struggle because the struggle feels meaningful. So let's go. Okay, so students would line up to die of dysentery or cholera, and there's something I think we need to understand here. First of all, there was that immediate, honest feedback with literally no sugarcoating. And I don't know, I kind of loved it. There's a clear connection between choices and consequences and failure with information and not judgment. We could immediately use that and try something else. It's almost like those choose your own adventure where sometimes you would end in failure, but each time you kind of learned what was happening and the rules of the game. So students at that time were choosing difficulty because the goal mattered to them, the winning. You could see, though, the cause and effect relationship instantly, and the game didn't lie to you or soften your blow at all. And the dying meant try again, not you're inadequate. It was genuinely hard. So, when have I seen students choose challenging work over easy alternatives? I will say for sure it is getting harder and harder because students often are choosing those easy alternatives. Even when I give options, what I have to help students understand is that the right answer for them is not the one that they think that they can do in the least struggling way. So if they have four and one of them said that, like, if their reasoning is, I think that this one would be easy for me, I think I'd have a lot to say. Maybe that's not the right option. And actually, I tell them that what I'm asking them to do and what they should always try to think about for themselves is what they can do that is the furthest stretch of their limits without pushing them to overwhelm. So, what I think we've done here, and I've gotten kind of on a tear lately about this, is we've accidentally taught students that confusion means that they're doing something wrong. Like if they are confused, it is because well, either they're doing something wrong or we're doing something wrong. So confusion has become a signal to rescue rather than a signal to persist. I'm confused. Help me. What am I doing wrong? Or it is evidence of being inadequate rather than evidence of growth. So if they are confused, that is something that is signaling to them, I am doing something wrong. And it also becomes a reason to simplify rather than a reason to support. So students themselves think that the answer to confusion is to make things easier, not to support and scaffold them up to understanding. And like I said, this is labeled a teacher failure rather than a natural part of the learning process. I found this specifically with Macbeth and students just not understanding that the struggle is the learning, that the same skills that they use in reading Macbeth are the same skills that they use to read. And that reading something with support above their reading level does help them actually become better readers because they're able to see the steps that it takes to do that. Um, it helps students to get a win with reading something that's difficult and challenging that they didn't think that they initially would be able to do. But that is not the way that we are treating accessibility these days. It often is turning into something that is pre-digested, something that is simplified to the point of meaninglessness and robbed of the productive struggle that creates learning. and something that's safe but shallow. I'm finding this not just in what we give our students, but also what we receive as teachers. And I think that this honestly is one of the reasons that what is happening right now is so unsatisfying with just the state of education, because we're given a lot of pre-digested material that we then have to deliver without the context, the structure, the principles, the pedagogy behind it, which means that everything is at such a basic level. And I don't mean basic as far as low, but basic as far as like simple, simple, straightforward. And learning is just not always like that. It's too safe. And in these ways, it also can make our learning too shallow. And when students get this, they don't get the ridges, the tension, the production, the productive struggle of learning. And more students are avoiding challenges because they've learned that failure means inadequacy, that they have always been rescued too quickly and too often. And that confusion is something bad that they need to avoid. They haven't had to do a lot of experience pushing through difficulty to get to a stronger competency. I think they also have a lot of trouble understanding, because of what we're doing, that there is something beyond an A or beyond a B or whatever they've chosen as their marker of acceptable. So I've seen this happen, like I said, a lot with students who shut down when they see something that's too difficult for them. I've seen it a lot in this past unit with Macbeth, where a student will just look at Shakespeare and say, I don't understand any of this at all. And it's like, okay, like you don't understand any of this at all? Zero things on the page do you understand? You don't understand that one word? No? I mean, because that's the thing, like one of our strategies is, well, what do you understand? If you were to just put that together, does that get you anywhere? Can you pinpoint where you're confused? When you are faced with a complex assignment, are you able to identify what is your struggle? Is it with your content? Is it with the directions? Is it with the the thinking task itself? And when students can pinpoint that, that helps us have a conversation that we can more specifically scaffold, and also so that we can get them past that confusion. I think students are so worried about asking questions. And actually, we've made it so that in a lot of ways they don't have to, because we've done a lot of giving them pretty much everything that they need in order to get their question answered without talking to anyone. I think that that's the way that they're living their lives right now. They can do a lot, like they can get a lot of answers by just using Google or now using ChatGPT, that they might not understand even what their real problem is because they don't have to struggle through finding it. So I definitely think there's a difference here between that productive struggle and overwhelming frustration, of course. Like we want our students to deal with productive struggle, but we don't want them to feel super frustrated. So we want students to understand that there's a clear goal and that they get feedback that helps them adjust, and that failure has a purpose, that it teaches them something, that that's data for going forward. Understanding what happens if you forget to build a shelter before the rainy season comes, that is something that's really important for them to understand, going back to that Oregon Trail example. Of course, we don't want them to be overwhelmingly frustrated. One of the things that I keep thinking about is the importance of giving feedback in a timely, like, this is something that I'm really rethinking in my 18th year here, about the way that we can give timely feedback. And I'm really leaning into this year how I can shorten assignments, shorten my own feedback cycle, give them tools where they get immediate feedback. So thinking about how I can more creatively use like no red ink or common lit, or things where they can get that feedback immediately, like using Wayground, formerly known as quizzes. Um, but knowing that they can get that answer immediately so that they can go into a different area of their feedback cycle or of their learning cycle. So we have gotten into this place where we have, like, we understand how this worked with our 1985 computer game, but we lost it in our actual classrooms as a entire educational system. So what's changed here? I think that we have forgotten that the struggle is the point. It's part of the learning process. It's not a bug of that. It's the entire feature. When we were playing Oregon Trail, the magic wasn't that it was a game. So the game was a little bit magical. It definitely wasn't the graphics, because those graphics were very simple. And even right now, if we had it in that little, like, um, very simple animation style, I think it would still have the same effect. I don't think it was the novelty of Oregon Trail itself, because once you understood what you were doing, it wasn't anything that was, well, it was a little bit of novelty. I will give it that. But really, I think it was that the struggle felt purposeful. Every bit of knowledge was, like, every failure gave us knowledge and led us to being better at the game. And we knew that the difficulty was the point. Like, we knew that it was hard. And that was I think that was a lesson, right? The game, the makers of the game knew that the Oregon Trail was difficult. So presenting it as easy would have defeated the purpose. Learning is not just easy all the time. And that's the point too. We shouldn't expect it to be easy. Easy would have been boring. Like, if we played Oregon Trail and it was an easy game, that would have been so boring. We would not have continued to want to play it. So we're working against that assumption that good teaching is the struggle. That, like, right now, what we're saying is good teaching makes things easy to understand. I'm not saying that we should make everything confusing. I don't think that those are necessarily the um the they're, like, in opposition, that those are the two polar opposites that we're trying to go to. Like, we're not trying to make things confusing, but we also, like, confusion is okay, and it's something to work through. And good teaching helps students work through confusion. It doesn't necessarily mean that we haven't explained things well enough. So it can mean, like, sometimes it's explaining it in a different way. And I think this is what's getting, like, really frustrating right now because of our clientele, our students right now, because we have all these things happening right now, that students have more difficulty understanding what they need to remember, because in part they're able to look up everything. So just the skill of remembering and pulling from their own knowledge and using that is something that they just do not get as much practice doing. But also it means that for us, we're leading with that expectation, because that is how we've taught and how we learned, that we would have some practices that we understood we would need to have to continue to pull from and use. And with our students, I think sometimes what's oftentimes happening is that they see that kind of knowledge as disposable because they can just go and grab it again. But the problem is that instead of going to the information that is already available to them, oftentimes what they're doing is they're regenerating. Let me give you a specific example. So I think that students now need to be taught that resources are recyclable. I think students need to be taught that their resources are recyclable, because of the way that I explained it. But here's what's making me think that. So when I tell a student that, I don't know, I'll give them, like, the MLI citation, and I'll tell them that the way that this works is that they're going to do the quote, they'll finish the quote, they'll have the citation, there is author, last name, and then space, page number, no comma in between, and then we will end with a period because the citation goes with the quote. So I may say that, oh my gosh, so many times. I may put it on the board, but each time it is like they do not remember that they've been told that information, because I think a bunch of things are happening. Students can look straight in your face and not process what you're saying. They've learned, and I think this is partly because of the way that they consume information. They're looking at things without processing them and remembering them. It happens to us all the time too, right? But I think that just because of the way that they're spending so much of their time, it is just more of a common practice among our students that they can still look engaged, but actually not be at all. So nothing is actually firing, even if they're listening. And I'm actually not trying to disparage our students. I just think that they have been wired differently and that this is something that we need to respond to. So in addition to that, I think that their information has been given to them in a way that's disposable. Like they know that they can go and look something up again. They don't necessarily even need to go into their notes. So this is something that is to them as easy to generate or to reestablish, to find again that information. That leads to a problem for us because each time it is like they are seeing the problem anew. And the solution is also new to them. Looking on the board or going back into their memory for what they already learned, like those things almost need to be reestablished. So we have to teach our students again to learn how to learn. And we're just in a very different place. So I think that this goes along with these ideas that we have to make those difficult things we're struggling with. We need to teach them how to go back and what they need to remember, what they need to actually retrieve and use, and also how they can work through confusion in ways that aren't just give me the answer, so that they are encountering genuine complexity. I think that this has always been our goal, but I think it's even more important now because of the way that our students are consuming information. So if they are not struggling, they're probably not learning, and we have made things incredibly easy for them to receive, and in some ways that's actually the problem. So when we are making things more accessible, we are trying to make struggle more productive, not eliminate it. And I think when we have made this move towards accessibility, we've removed some of the friction that actually makes learning possible. So, like your brain doesn't change when information flows in easily, it's those neural pathways strengthening when you have to work to make those connections. So the difficulty is what creates those learning opportunities and the learning itself. And we really need to think about how much struggle we're removing, because that means that we're removing the mechanism of learning itself. Students forget information they understood in class. They are like, this explains why summarized or simplified versions don't stick as well. And we already know that sometimes we need our students to do the work of putting the study guide together, getting the notes and putting those together. They're just having so much trouble with transferring knowledge because they haven't struggled with it. And AI is reducing some of that, giving them the answers, explaining things clearly, explaining even their gobbledygook back to them in a clear way. So it simplifies that complexity if they need it to, or if they ask it to be simpler. So it's reducing all of that wrestling with confusion and making those unexpected connections, persisting through difficulty, and really staying in it, building tolerance for complexity. And also that means that our students have less of the satisfaction of figuring something out. So when we take all that together, it makes sense that our students would misunderstand what learning is because they haven't actually needed to do as much of it. But we do have the power to put a focus on our job as teachers to make that productive struggle something that is more at the forefront of our classroom. I don't think that we need to compete with AI by being clearer or faster. I actually think our job is to create conditions where productive struggle is irresistible and also to slow down to help them feel that struggle and to work through it, just like Oregon Trail did. So I think that there is a lot that we need to work through because we do have students that are at all kinds of levels of readiness and that will struggle without support. And if they do not have the support, of course, this would bring them into overwhelm. So we have the job that we have been hired to deal with students that are at those different readiness levels. So it does become something that's important. And I do think like we need to have more permission to work through this and not have to move on always. I think that if we have students, like if we're talking about writing, I think we need to go back to some of the strategies we really know well. We can give student opportunities to write more, to discuss more. We need to be okay with not everything going through us. And also, we need to be okay with students maybe starting at a step that they wouldn't have been able to before. So if we want students to understand how to work with, I don't know, thesis statement, but they've never written a paragraph, we need to give them the opportunity to still go to that skill. So figuring out ways that we can help students struggle at like through all skills, because it's a different skill to write a thesis statement than to write a paragraph, right? But if we have them sequentially so that they never get to that thesis statement, like what are we doing? There are ways, right? We don't necessarily have to have them write the paragraph in order to get to the thesis statement to be able to practice that skill. We can give students assertions, we can give them paragraphs, we can have them work through that skill. And then when we come back to it, they're in a different place because they have another understanding, they've seen some success. This is something that we can work through. We can use a scaffold and still have students struggle appropriately. So we don't need to eliminate the scaffolds, but it's like keeping their struggle appropriate. And to be honest, like if we keep hammering on the same problems or the same skills that they need to work on without allowing them to have success, like that's a problem, a different problem, right? I also want us to think about this. Oregon Trail didn't have an easy mode, right? It had strategy. And we need to think differently about what it is that we give students and how we are helping them through their work. I don't think, of course, like I'm not talking about everyone, and maybe I'm not even talking, like I'm talking about myself, honestly. Like sometimes what I do is the easiest to move on. And what I'm doing more and more of is thinking about how I can help students to actually have the skills that they need and make sure that I'm building specifically or intentionally throughout the year. So we won't learn, you know, the 75, 125 skills that are in our pacing guide, but you are going to understand characterization. You're going to understand theme. So you're going to understand how to write a paragraph. You're going to understand the structure of an essay. There are things that I have that I am sure that you are going to struggle through and understand by the end of the year. And what I need to do as I'm building is make sure that the students that are not struggling through that can move on to something else that is going to have some kind of friction for them. As I'm saying this, and I always do this, right? Like I'll say something out loud that I've thought through and realize that this is something that we've been told over and over again. But I think what's been like we have the same problem as our students do, in that what we're also being given is the lowest common denominator. It's given to us in pieces and in simplified versions that are universal to everyone. And that means that we also cannot struggle through the tension of having to work through how this actually works in practice for students that need it. So when we say we need to, what I just said was I need to be sure that my students that are ready for challenge get it. That's what we we want to think about students that have the skill. What do we do with them? If students do not have a skill, what do we do with them? Like once we've taught the skill and they still don't have it, then what do we do? Like these are basics of our learning, but of our teaching, but there are also things that we don't necessarily always have time to work through for every unit. So it's just giving ourselves permission to slow down and to think through what is actually important for our students to learn, how we can make sure that they get there, and what we can do to push the students that are already there. So basics, I know, but also I think what's important, and I'll emphasize it again, is giving ourselves permission to take the time to do it. So slowing down when we need to, which, like I said, I'll say it again, it doesn't necessarily mean holding up the text. You can stay with a skill without staying with the text. And it might mean being sure that when you spiral back through, that you are hitting students in different ways. So, and also meaning a scaffold is not forever, right? So a student that needs a simplified version right now, because that would help them to struggle in the appropriate ways, may not need it the next time. So being sure that we are constantly evaluating our students and thinking about what we are doing to keep their access, but also create competencies for our students. So my approach is always to let students try first. Before I put my scaffolds in place, I want to see what you can do, and then we'll work. Because I think the worst thing that we can do is to show students both by what we give them and also by what we don't give them, where what we think is important and how what learning actually is in our class. Okay, so if the struggle is the point, how do we actually create those Oregon Trail moments in English class? I have 4 ways to design those Oregon Trail moments in your classroom, things that I'm doing in my own classroom that I want to share with you. Okay, so the first one is this core principle that their Oregon Trail had clear goals with uncertain paths, immediate feedback on decisions, permission to fail forward, and student choice approach. So the first strategy here is frame challenging text as worthwhile, not obstacles. Telling students that the text is difficult and that's why it's reading, that you will be confused and that means it's working, and that the difference between what we read for class and what you read personally can be different because they serve different purposes. So, and also having space for multiple reads, I think is so important here. So having our first read for noticing what confuses you. So just gathering data and using that confusion as information and understanding that difficulty signals importance, not impossibility. I tell my students that one of the things that I want them to do is choose tasks and choose questions, choose assertions, choose analysis threads as something that is worthy of their time. So when we teach like Macbeth, for example, the unit that I'm currently in, it is genuinely hard, right? It's not easy, but there is a reason why people still read it. It requires you to think, and you are rewarded by thinking. I think it's important to understand that students who believe you will lean in, and the struggle become the point. Second strategy here is create low stakes struggle opportunities. So a lot of what we do is feels high stakes to students, even if it is not. So being delivering information and helping students understand that not everything is high stakes. Everything they should put in the same effort, they should try, but understand that if they try and fail, then that's okay. I know that sometimes in my classroom, I said that out loud, but my grading didn't necessarily reflect that. So making sure that when I do tell them that it's okay to fail, that they get feedback that they have. Not necessarily that they've received an F, but that this didn't work. that they need to do it in a different way. They need to have more friction or tension in their work. So doing things where they should be expecting confusion. So maybe it's doing daily poetry and just sitting with, what do you think about this? And not necessarily resolving the answers. Having discussion protocol where there is confusion built in, like we are going to have different ideas, and that's not a problem. Like we don't necessarily even need to resolve it, just labeling it and maybe even complicating it. Thinking about like reading journals and tracking that, like what confused me and what I tried, what I'm working through. And honestly, like the more I read text, and some of these texts that I've read over and over again, the more I'm like, you know what? There is a lot of unresolved tension here, a lot of unresolved conflict. I am not sure. I will say, I am not sure exactly what Mary Shelley is saying in Frankenstein. Is she pro technology or is she against it? I am not even sure because I can make arguments, good arguments for both sides. And I think it's important that students understand that that is the way that a lot of this works, that we can hold both of those tensions at the same time. And I think that, like, something that we need to have more of is bad first draft. I don't know if I think a lot of authors have talked about this, that their first drafts are trash. And expecting our students to come up with a first draft that is not trash is maybe not fair. So normalizing that struggle is a part of the process, and it isn't evidence of failure. That a trashy first draft is fine and actually something to be celebrated, because then you have probably more threads to pull on because you've come up with a lot of ideas. And then I would say one of the things that I like to do in my classroom is really have students track their confusion, and they can do that with like highlighting things that they understand really well and where they don't. Strategy 3, designing assignments that require struggle. So really thinking about questions that don't have easy answers. So characteristics where the goal is clear, like Oregon Trail, survive to Oregon. Your goal is clear. Analyze power and Macbeth. But the path may be uncertain because there are many ways to get there, right? Trying to give students that Oregon Trail path, choices have consequences. So giving them as much as possible immediate feedback on their thinking. And also that Oregon Trail failure teaches something. So revision based on what didn't work. And I've said this several times across this episode and even the last episode, that what we really need to work on is giving students opportunities to get faster feedback. And I know how much we love to give detailed feedback about everything. But really what is more important here is that students are getting feedback fast. So and I know I've done the math, you've done the math, if we spend just 1 minute on each student, that means if we have 150 students, we're spending like 2.5 hours on our students. So it needs to be less than that, right? Because we don't have 2.5 hours a week. So what can we do to leverage technology to shorten our assignment, to do things in ways that we can give feedback? Maybe there's something that they can get feedback on as a checklist or whatever, but getting faster feedback and being able to put that into a feedback cycle. So design moves that I'm including is requiring showing their thinking, not just the answer, building in revision and expecting multiple attempts, making messy middle and beginning visible and valued, and having that be something that I actually assess, that messy middle and their attempt to make it cleaner and celebrate those productive wrong turns. I know that I've had lots of times where students will get to a point where they're like, I'm not even sure that this works out. So what do I do now? Because I have an essay to write. So do I choose something that's easy? Do I choose something that I know is going to work? I want to make sure that I am celebrating and making in my process it okay for you to go down a path that doesn't pan out the way that you expect, or even in a way that is worth continuing. So I want to help students through that problem, through that trouble, thinking about what to do when the path that they thought was going to work no longer does. So this is having a clear goal, but with an uncertain path, and making sure that the struggle is the work and keeping my assessment on the focus on the struggle. The fourth strategy here is using discussion as productive struggle space. So what happens a lot is teacher asks, student answers, teacher evaluates. We can think about that as a discussion structure or also a writing structure. So a student might make a claim, other students complicate it, and then the thinking evolves. That's what we want to move toward. So in this case, there's no right answer to discover, just better thinking to build. And that is the process. So my role here is to create conditions for struggle, not for resolving struggle, and making sure that productive confusion leads somewhere. So this could be leave with better questions, not final answers. That's our goal here. In Socratic seminars, I love when there's no resolution. I like for us to come to consensus sometimes, but I also like when we can say, wow, this is really complicated. We've laid out a lot of ideas. We might have something that we think works, but we also can live with the tension of having something that is not exactly resolved. That helps us get somewhere where we can build intellectual stamina for complexity. So like staying in that tension and thinking through the possibilities and the nuance. And I'm sure that you can see why this matters, not just for our classroom, but for our culture, that we can look at and appreciate other ideas without losing what we brought to the conversation. And also thinking about like, okay, maybe this issue, this problem, this question is more complex than we initially thought it was. So not necessarily needing to come to one side or the other, but seeing that that's it, that there's complexity and that's something to live in and understand and appreciate. So in this case, the discussion creates that productive confusion and not clarity. I know that that can be challenging for students, but I think that it's important for them to understand that it's okay for us to have different opinions about things, and when they are based in logical thinking and we have reasoning behind it, that we may come to different conclusions when seeing the same data. And we need to have that kind of investigation in our classrooms so that students can bring it to their lives. There are larger stakes here, right? Not just in our public discourse, but also in their understanding of their purpose and how technology and their peers contribute to their purpose. So when AI can produce answers, students still need to struggle with complexity. And there's a true danger in students not understanding that, like, what they're getting when they put something into AI or when they put something into Google, and thinking that there is necessarily a answer that is achievable to complex questions with a simple query. So we need to help them understand that depth is important and valued over efficiency, because ultimately we're not optimizing for ease over learning. And we really need to create these spaces for productive struggle so that they build that tolerance for confusion and they experience the satisfaction of figuring things out and persisting through difficulty too, so that they actually learn to think, because that is genuine, messy, confusing, and sometimes a struggle. And we need them to learn that. So what we're really teaching is trying to get back to that Oregon Trail moment where students were lining up to play that game and experiencing flow state, where the challenge matches capability and that the feedback is immediate. And as I've said a couple of times, that they have clear goals, but uncertainty in achieving them. So that's not just gaming, that's optimal learning, and that's what we really want to try to chase. We can create that in English class, not with those pixelated wagons or gamified gimmicks, but with real, genuine intellectual challenge that feels worth struggling through. So we know that Oregon Trail was culturally neutral. Like nobody worried about the political implications of dysentery or whether wagon wheel metaphors might be problematic. It was just safe to engage with. And we can compare that to teaching literature today, that we have a lot to deal with, that cultural connections often feel loaded. But we can give ourselves permission to struggle and understand that it's not our failure if they do, because that is how learning works. So you have the power to make things purposeful, create conditions where difficulty signals importance, and that students are experiencing the satisfaction of figuring something out, just like Oregon Trail did in 1985. So what I think we need to do now is understand that challenging our students is important and that difficult opportunities can be very meaningful. We need to help them to understand the purpose of frustration and that there are times when frustration is totally appropriate. Because if your students aren't struggling a little bit, they're probably not learning much. So see you next week, and until then, keep thinking outside the script.